Hi, welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter, and today I am really honoured and delighted and excited to be joined by Lisa Morrison. Hi, Lisa, how are you?
Hi, Jane. Lovely to join you here.
Thanks,
Keep
Lisa, for
thanks.
taking the time. Um, we've met before online and actually in person too at events in Belfast, I think, and possibly elsewhere. So it's really lovely to have you as a guest because I've thought about you for a while. And maybe to begin with, you can just tell me a bit about yourself and your background, Lisa, please.
Sure. Well, it's lovely to be here. Yes, because we have met over the ether and on Twitter and things. So it's always good to talk. A friend of mine said yesterday, yes, you do like to talk. I do. I never used to,
Me
but I
too.
found my voice.
Oh,
So yeah,
excellent. Now you don't
yeah,
want to stop using it.
yeah. So I guess a little bit about me, a snapshot. I was born in South Africa and I moved to Northern Ireland in 2000. So 24 years I've been living here. My husband was from here. Um, and yeah, in South Africa, I guess to say in terms of our conversation,
Mhm.
I saw my first psychiatrist at the age of 14 and was put on medication.
Okay.
So I have a long history in mental health services and have yet to leave, but
Okay.
that is on the agenda. So yeah, that spans and experiences in South Africa. With that, I was at the age of about 19. I left school actually to do my law degree,
Okay.
but was very unwell and had been unwell and ended up in what would now be considered one of the old asylums.
Okay.
I was in there for about 6 months. After that, my background is actually early years education. So I went back and started working from the ground up with young children,
Nice.
um, and ended up becoming a teacher, an early years teacher in South Africa. That's what I was doing when Gary and I moved here. I didn't actually do a degree, so my qualifications weren't transferable, but I worked at a school here for children with profound learning difficulties for 5 years, and then worked with Sure Start,
Okay.
um, which is for children 0 to 4. Do you know about Sure Start? I
Yeah, I
think
think
it's
it's a bit like one of the famous programs in the States for kids who are very they've complex needs due to maybe poverty
it's
and stuff,
more,
is it? An
yes,
anti-poverty
yes.
program?
Yeah, it's for families living in more deprived areas.
Hmm.
So I loved that. Did a lot of group work. That's always been my favorite thing is training, group work. I love working with groups of people. And then I became very unwell again. I had my two children, Hannah and Matthew, here in 2002 and 2004. Um, and yeah, I struggled then also a bit
Hmm.
with my mental health, for want of a better word. I'd also by that time accrued about 5 different diagnoses.
Right.
Um, I was severely mentally ill.
Mhm.
And yeah, there were triggers for me, I think, at a certain time in 2008. And between 2009 and 2017, I spent many months of every year in and out of our local psychiatric inpatient unit here in the trust in which I live. And over that time, I lost my marriage. Well, my husband and I separated.
Hmm.
It was just too difficult for him trying to manage the kids
Yeah.
and me, self-harm. And yeah, and I guess just to say as well in this, for anybody listening, I guess it can also be difficult, I suppose, not that I'm going to go into detail about anything, but I'm always just conscious to say,
Yes. That it
we
could be
never know.
activating.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And it can sometimes be innocuous things that can trigger people. So just for anybody who is maybe listening, just to be mindful of that,
Mm.
and you don't, yeah,
Thanks,
just to do
Lisa.
what you need around it. Um, yeah, so and I lost my job and became very, very isolated.
Okay.
And it was really managing symptoms, it was managing the self-harm, suicidality, and all of that. And in 2017, I ended up in a treatment center in South Africa, a 12-step rehab program. It
Okay.
wasn't alcohol addiction. They kind of looked at all the medication and self-harm as one of those things.
Okay.
Spent 5 months there and came back here actually at this time of year, October 2017, and really started really rebuilding my life, I suppose. I came off all the medication I was on,
Wow.
having to relearn a lot of stuff. I'd had electroconvulsive therapy on multiple occasions in South Africa and also here. So it was really starting from scratch, getting my driver's license back, learning to,
Mhm.
and I volunteered at our local health trust. We had a mental health forum, service user kind of group, and a recovery college as well. And I ended up being employed there. So actually working in the mental health service, I got a key to the door, which I'd
Wow.
usually
Yeah.
locked behind. Yeah.
Trusted
So
with the
that
key, Lisa. Yeah.
yeah, it was all a bit scary for them.
Yeah.
Very exciting for me. Yeah, so that was a really interesting journey for me as well, working there. And I did a lot of work locally and regionally, on various projects and co-production. I put in inverted commas. And I was hungry to learn about the system I'd been a person using for my whole
Hmm.
life, and also started to see many staff experiencing very similar things that I had experienced as a person in the service,
Mm.
not feeling heard,
Yeah.
not having a voice, that autonomy, choice, that being done to, just those. So I started to see that as well. So it was
Interesting.
yeah, it was really. Um, And I left then in 2020 when COVID hit, and we did some work around. Sorry, that is my dog. Dexter, my dog,
Oh, I
is,
know. I've seen Dexter many times on
Dexter,
Twitter. Yeah, yeah.
and he always stays in here with me. And now he's whining to go out, and I am so sorry,
You
but he
can let
always
him
says,
out.
"Can I let him out?
Of course you can. Yeah.
Just 2 minutes."
Yeah, no problem. He does it. He finds it
He's
boring
my
so
best.
far.
Yeah, he's my regulating tool.
Yeah.
We can
It's
talk about
beautiful.
that. Yeah, so, but it ended up quite re-traumatizing for me, working in the service. And there was a silencing in that you're told you're inspirational in all these
Ah,
things, and then nothing actually ever changes.
right.
Um, you know, but difficult for people working in the service as well. And there were also fabulous experiences, working with staff. Um, so I left in 2020. They moved actually the recovery college to an old asylum here.
Hmm.
And nobody heard why that might be difficult for me. And I think that was
Right.
challenging.
Okay.
Um, but there were many factors. But I learned a lot. Um, and decided when I was angry all the time and driving to work and thinking I wasn't worth anything and what I was doing wasn't worth anything, I had to sit back and say, this is this is
Mm-hmm.
a price that, yeah, you can't pay. So
Hmm.
I left and decided to start up my own business, which I was always going to do anyway. And that was kind of a bit of a leap of faith. And
Yeah.
that takes me to 2021. And I've been very fortunate and blessed with people, I suppose, who felt that there was a space
Mm.
for, what I was doing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think if that kind of gives you a bit of a
Yeah, no,
snapshot.
it's great because I knew some of it and obviously not all of it. Um, and you write some poetry, don't you, Lisa, about your
Yeah.
experiences? Yeah.
Yes. And actually, I'll share with you a poem. And I guess just to say in my introduction, I work for myself and I work actually with a lot of staff working in statutory services. I also work 2 days a week with an organization, Participation and Practice of Rights, on their campaign, New Script for Mental Health, which is very much about a lot of the work that I hear you talking about in that, but looking at the broader issues around mental health, not the individualization of it, but kind of that,
The
so yeah, and
context.
that's been a privilege as well. I work with for them 2 days a week. So a poem I actually wrote this for the Towards Zero Suicide program. I turned 50 last year and I didn't think I'd live till 50.
Wow.
So that was a big year, yeah, really. And I guess this makes me think of it anyway. So the poem is called Blinded. What did you see when you looked at me? Bandaged, broken, breaking down. Symptoms smothering, suffocating sound. Risk assessed year on year, those boxes ticked. The plans you made, the same each time, which I then went and disobeyed. Repeat offender, that was me. Revolving door we all could see. Or not. Textbooks teach many truths, they have their place. But I am me and you are you. Did you not see? 100 stories carved upon my skin. Speak a truth I needed heard. But I'd been labeled to be understood. And a heavy cost was incurred. Not all is as it seems, you know, for you nor me. Behind the walls and masks we wear, we're all just human. We all know despair. So before you judge or label me, please make some space and truly see.
Thank you, Lisa. Wow, it was interesting being the you in that, having you recite it to me,
No,
an interesting experience. And it's so true that we don't know what is going on in the lives of others. You don't know what's in my life right now, and
no,
this is the way it is all around the world. People are carrying heavy loads, some heavier than others, and we're
yeah.
clueless and we're not often curious enough. So I really appreciate you sharing that with me. So from us following each other online, you'll know that I'm very interested in kind of the biopsychosocial origins of health in its totality, not just mental health, but physical health too, and relationships and behavior problems. So, as someone who experienced profound emotional distress, had this dysregulated nervous system for a long, long time, and I believe you experienced some dissociation and you described feeling suicidal there. Did anyone that you encounter kind of discuss the harmful impacts of trauma with you and its consequences?
Never.
Wow.
Yeah.
With all
I
of that.
actually,
Okay.
yeah, and I have a history from I first saw a psychiatrist at age 14. You know, it wasn't that it wasn't even known. Now,
Hmm.
not everything that had happened was known, and there are all sorts of issues around that, but you know, and even into my early adult life and then into my more recent adult life, there has been significant trauma. Um, and I've only learnt about that by chance, coming back from the treatment center, starting to work in services, starting to learn about things, listening to different things, Drop the Disorder, some of their work that they would talk about, reading, wanting hang books in the library. We had trying to understand what this was. I'd been on medication for nearly 30 years of my life. When I went into the treatment center, I was on 2 antipsychotics, 4 tranquilizers, an antidepressant, and a sleeping tablet, you know, and had been at various stages in my life on very high doses. So I really wanted to understand so I just started reading and started to learn about the world of trauma and the impact of trauma. Um, and I have a diagnosis of schizoid personality disorder, schizoaffective, bipolar,
Right.
major depression with psychotic features, anorexia, bulimia. Then in 2011, because of the self-harm and the suicide attempts, which had been there my whole life as well, I was then diagnosed with EUPD, which we know
Oh,
is, but I mean, I was
personality disorder.
38. Yeah, I was 38 or something at that time. And when I started to read, I thought nobody in psychiatry has diagnosed me with a post-traumatic stress disorder,
Mhm.
despite significant what they knew, and they didn't know everything because of some really bad experiences of not being believed about some things.
Right.
Um, yeah, nobody had spoken about that. So
Okay.
it was my own knowledge, and I actually challenged my diagnosis. Um, and it was a bizarre set of circumstances that actually got it changed. And I had about six different assessments by clinical psychologists um, that I knew in the trust because of a situation that happened to me in the trust when I was working there. And she said she just couldn't stand by that diagnosis. I clearly had complex trauma, and
Right.
I've got quite a severe dissociative disorder.
Okay.
I don't call it a disorder,
Hmm.
but on the spectrum of that, it would be considered quite severe that the trust even ended up having to get specialist treatment
Okay.
for me for it.
And for those, well, for those who know, but certainly, like I interviewed Ruth Lanius, who's a doctor, a
Yeah.
psychiatrist who's very experienced with
Yeah.
dissociation, and Christine Forner. It's a huge indicator for serious trauma, early life trauma, and then the forgetfulness, the not being able to recount things that happened, complete blank periods. It's rather shocking to me as a non-clinician that it wouldn't have raised a few flags for people to explore it more deeply with you. Um, so, Lisa, when you found this out, up until that point, had you thought that there was just something fundamentally wrong with you, that it was
Up
you that was
until two,
broken?
Up until 2017, I believed that there was a chemical imbalance in my brain
Right,
and that
okay.
there was something wrong with me,
Mm,
actually. This is all new. It's almost like I've started a life again, nearly at the age of 45 or whenever it was. I didn't know about any of this stuff. And in fact, what I've discovered since is that people with dissociative disorders often end up like me in a psychiatric system with many labels and not. And in fact, Ruth Lanius is one of my therapist actually, I've just been so fortunate to have found her, but she's done this work, and funnily enough, she's a psychiatrist as well,
mm.
which is quite,
There are
you
some
know,
good ones.
not practicing as one anymore, but
Yeah.
yeah, because they've done some studies in Canada, top D studies
Mm,
over there. And I mean, it's just showing the understanding. There is no understanding in mental health services. Trauma, the understanding of trauma is so limited,
yes.
and in the
Shockingly limited.
syllabus as well,
Mm,
let alone dissociation is just not. And I've actually got some of my notes from those inpatient times because I have severe memory loss as well from the electroconvulsive
mm,
therapy. And I can actually see my different parts. You can actually see the dissociation is so, for anybody who's looking, who
mm,
knows,
mm,
clearly the different parts, the voices, all of that would have been seen as psychosis.
mm.
Need a lot of education about that.
Yeah. And that kind of brings me rather nicely to the next question, because I'm quite interested in this group called the Critical Voices Network, and I'd be familiar with Drop the Disorder and MAD in the UK and MAD in America and MAD
Mm,
in Ireland. There are growing movements of people
mm,
who are identifying serious harms with psychiatry. Not for everyone. Um, but plenty of people describe themselves now as survivors of psychiatry, aside from anything else. And does that phrase resonate with you in terms of your own experiences now of psychiatric treatment, Lisa?
I think very much so. I'm very conscious of language,
Hmm.
you know, especially having worked in the service. And I guess for me, a lot of my treatment wasn't bad treatment. It wasn't people setting out to cause harm.
I get
Some
you.
people have deliberately, experienced, and I know of people in my work in that who have. that wasn't my experience here in the north of Ireland. There was some horrendous experiences in the emergency department, I
Right.
have to say, like where I needed internal and external stitches and wasn't given anesthetic for that,
Wow.
experiences like that, I mean, in recent years. And in the old asylum in South Africa, I was in a straitjacket, padded cell, and those are traumas. When I was in a lockup ward, we were lined up and showered down. We were stood
Mm.
as women, stripped, showered in front of, stripped and left in a cell overnight. And that's, yeah,
Humiliating for any woman.
yeah, yeah. I mean, just really dehumanizing treatment.
Mm.
And I was only 19 at the time. So yeah, there's knock on from that. I think though my whole identity was tied up with being mentally ill. There was
Sure.
something fundamentally wrong with me, and that's always what I was going to have. So it did become my identity, and in a service which was very focused on risk management, risk assessment,
Mm.
um, and they were terrified, that I was going to die. So that's what the focus began. And I was lost in all of that because they didn't know what else to do. And it's a very medicalized system. So you're given medication. I did believe that the right combination of medication was going to make this better.
Mm.
On some level, I knew different because I'd read a whole lot.
Mm.
But yeah, and the ECT, I had 6 courses over 7 years of ECT, shocks to the brain. And I sometimes wanted it because I was going to get an anesthetic that meant it felt like dying,
Mm.
and it gave me that momentary relief. And I think it's
Wow.
very sad. I was never told either about that I could lose all the memories of my children, their birthdays, significant events in their lives. I'm still remembering things I've forgotten. I don't remember my marriage.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and what I know now, because I'm actually part of a campaign group around ECT, and it's around informed consent, because I've
Yeah,
learned more and more that when you are labeled as mentally ill, and people have a right to choose how they,
sure.
and everybody does. So
Yes.
for me, it's about choice. But at the minute, you've only got that option to have a diagnosis, and it is very much framed as being something wrong in you that you're going to have for the rest of your life.
Mm.
Um,
And something that you were born with. That's how it sounds to
yeah,
me. That like
yeah,
Lisa came into the world with this faulty brain and the chemicals,
yeah,
that were shot to hell somehow, without again any understanding, it seems, of the what happened to you at various points along the way that really we now know, or some of us know, are the key things that shape a person's
correct.
neurobiology and ability to feel safe and comfortable in the world and to trust other
Yeah,
people and to hope for the future, all of that. So
yeah,
that is quite shocking. But do you think that the main reason for some of the harms that you suffered was in fact this trauma blindness of the system and the people
yeah.
working in it?
So, and in some ways, I've ended up back in the psychiatric unit over the last few years but I've gone in there because there's no other option for me
Yes.
to go when I've been very dysregulated. And it's very hard to hold on to your truth of I'm not ill. This
Yeah.
is part of, I have had untreated trauma for a lifetime of it, and then compounded harms in the system
Yeah.
because it wasn't recognized or treated. But in those times when I've been in very much on my own terms, I've had conversations with nursing staff who knew me before. And there was a lot of fear, not knowing what to do. People don't know what to do when people disclose sexual abuse,
Mm.
childhood trauma. What do we say? We don't want to make this worse. People don't know any different.
Mm.
And then the environments that we go to for highly distressed people are very clinical environments, devoid of anything that helps you soothe or regulate. And talk about relationships,
Mm.
Jane.
Yeah.
You are a less than person when you suffer extreme states, severe distress. experiences that other people don't understand. You begin to believe you're not trustworthy,
Yeah.
you're stupid. There's all sorts of subliminal messages that you get, and I'm only realizing this now. It's so deeply ingrained in me. It can be triggered in a moment, really. And that's worrying that we're putting people, and you don't, yeah. Anyway,
I get what you're saying, I think, in the sense that I got a glimmer of it myself during the PhD when I spoke to someone, and I was more or less told that me even asking about trauma or mental health, that I shouldn't be doing it as someone without a psychiatric background, as in being a psychiatrist. And it kind of made me shudder a little bit because I was going, I've only asked a question here and I've touched a nerve so badly. If I were someone with a mental health diagnosis, I can see how to someone like this, I would be fundamentally untrustworthy. Nothing that I ever said, or if I said, I believe you're not treating me right, I don't like this, I don't want this. You are just, your prior diagnoses, and you had so many of them,
correct,
render you such
correct,
a dodgy witness in the world, to certain
correct.
people. I'm obviously not saying that's true, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
how can you be believed? And not being believed, I can also understand would be a horrific trigger when you're imparting a piece of your truth and being shut down.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and so do you think then this kind of dominant biomedical model of psychiatry does get in the way of forming a safe, trusting relationship?
I do. I think I think our systems are set up. It's about power, Jane, for me. There's serious power imbalances, and Daniel Puris, who was the ex-health special rapporteur, health talked about not chemical but power imbalances.
Hmm.
And I think they play out in our systems for staff and for people in those systems. But you're definitely the person at the bottom rung of the ladder in the system. And I remember actually my therapist, who I'm still with, I've been working with for 4.5 years, in about the first 6 months of our therapy. And you see, understanding dissociation, do you see somebody giving me a language
Mm,
that suddenly made sense of my whole life? It's a language I knew.
mm,
It wasn't like anything bizarre to me. It was somebody is giving me something that I can tell my story that
yeah.
makes sense, that I know is true for me.
Mm.
It was like incredible after all these years. But I remember she gave me once from her garden a chamomile plant. I talked about loving herbs and things.
Okay.
And it was like, oh, this woman has given me something from her house
Yeah.
that's going to go into my house. Like, whoa, is this okay? Is this boundary okay?
Right.
Do you know? And that's like a serious indictment in terms of our relationships and how connected we feel. That was, and it stays with me it's probably one of the biggest things in my relationship with her.
Wow.
And the fact that even though she wouldn't call herself an expert, but she is in working with complex trauma and dissociation. Um, that she can also say sometimes I don't know, or
Yeah.
actually I messed up there,
Yeah. Wow.
you
Amazing.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm really sorry, I didn't handle that well. So that
So
whole
important.
shift of, and we don't have that. And also, I think there's an expectation on professionals that they have all the answers because they're told they should have all the answers. And yet, we are such complex human beings. And the education and training we need to get in at student level to be teaching about the biology, physiology, what happens with trauma for all of us, because trauma can
Yes.
become a word that can exclude if you don't have the big T's.
Yes.
That's why I like Dr. Karen Treisman's work, because she talks about trauma, adversity, and culturally
Yeah.
aware. Suddenly that's about all of us,
Yes.
you know.
And not
And I
just the
teach,
other people over there. Yeah.
yeah, because it affects how we show up at a meeting, how
Yes.
we may be triggered in something. And if we understand, I teach, the polyvagal theory, context, connection, choice. They're three basic principles. So often in the context of wherever we're doing whatever interaction relationally, you think about, do you know the why, the what, and the how of what's going on here? Do we equip people with that? Choice.
Yeah.
How many choices do we have in this? And then and what is this environment even like? How's it set up to feel safe or not safe? We all can walk into a room and know that feeling of, you know, something's not okay here. What is that about?
Yes. And that's an
As human beings,
energy.
we're evolved. Yeah.
That's
But
essentially an energy.
it's our neuroception.
Mm.
Stephen Paul just talks about neuroception that you pick up. Our nervous system is seeking for those things to feel safe, and it's context, connection, and choice. Those are the things we're looking for.
That's a lovely story, though, about your therapist giving that little gift, and so many services get all spooked about receiving gifts as well from people that they serve, because as though a box of chocolates is going to right away mean that you can't, have a tough conversation or challenge some faulty thinking or whatever else. And basically, it's just human. Humans like showing appreciation for one another, and kind of even saying this that therapy phrase that I had you in mind. I was holding you in mind. That by giving you this little plant, you matter to
Yeah,
me in a way. I think it's
yeah.
it's a beautiful thing to be able to do. Um, and but boundaries, we can also hide behind them, as professionals, and not want to give a little bit of ourselves. And as you say, the rupture there is very natural as well. Human beings do make mistakes, and it's foolish to pretend that any of us are infallible. And by apologizing to you, saying I didn't get it right that time, that's also remedying the inherent power imbalance a little bit, isn't it,
And
really?
it's also saying, I can also mess up,
Yes,
and she's saying it's not, and with trauma, you're harmed in relationship, you heal in relationship, but that can also be really challenging because relationships is where you were harmed. So
yes.
you can be quite, relationships can be even more difficult when your early experiences are about being harmed in that.
So, can people really heal on their own, pretty much entirely on their own, or do you think it needs to happen somehow in connection with other people?
Well, if we look at it, we're biologically wired to connect. It's a
Hmm.
basic human need. And I think we're taught that, babies and all that need a lot of that co-regulation and everything. But I think we're living in a society that says, when you grow up, then you got to get on with it. And it's self-regulation, self-care, it's very individualistic. And whilst, of course, that is important that we do those things, it's a biological imperative. Co-regulation is a biological imperative for the rest of our lives.
Mm.
So it's in us to need others. And we know the impact of just loneliness and isolation on human beings and on their physical health, their mental health, their emotional health. So people do extraordinary things with extraordinarily little, you
Hmm.
know, but we need each other.
Yeah.
It's a basic human need. We need each other, but those need to be safe enough relationships. My therapist often talks about safe enough, or because sometimes can be difficult when the world has always felt like a dangerous place.
Yeah, that's a great point.
What does safe even mean?
Mm.
And sometimes what's safe, I mean, for a long, triggers can be things like compliments or
Right.
people telling you, especially if where there's been grooming or where
Uh-huh.
people have manipulated and used you. We assume that that's why understanding our how our physiology, our nervous system reacts to these things, it doesn't necessarily make sense to people, but if we understand how trauma impacts our bodies, our brains, our memories, because you even process, trauma memories are held
Yes.
differently. Um, when we understand all of that, then we might understand why a certain situation actually makes somebody angry,
Mm.
or all these different ways that we kind of behave that often aren't understood.
Mm.
So yes, I think we need each other. For me, you know, I was very isolated. I've always had friends, but I was disconnected from myself. There was the body and there was me.
Hmm.
Um,
In two
and
different
they don't,
stratospheres. Yeah.
yeah, they didn't even, but then there was disconnection from people around because people hurt you,
Yeah.
so eventually you either deal with it on your own or you swing between really needing people you really need. I was more on the other. There's all sorts of things that come from not having those, I suppose, secure attachments, all that. And your wiring is different.
Yes.
We can rewire or build new
Hmm.
networks, but it takes time. And that's why in services, there is a responsibility to learn about the impact of trauma, because I can tell you, I've been in many psychiatric hospitals and I know many of the people in there are traumatized, have had trauma in their life.
Mm.
So our system is not set up to help even for the people working in it. Um, yeah, so we need each other
Yeah, that's an
and we need to
interesting
make that
point
okay.
about the helpers as well. That helpers often become helpers because they want to resolve something or they're driven, to rescue or to heal, but for particular reasons that may or may not be conscious entirely to them.
Yeah.
And then I think it's a great point that the system can be abusive to those working in it too. Because if I want to help you, Lisa, as a psychologist, but I can only offer you certain things, like 6 sessions of CBT or only medications, that there isn't some
Mhm.
sort of body-based therapy that I can offer you over a sufficiently long period of time. So I know I'm not really helping you or really meeting your need. That must start to get frustrating and aggravating for people working in the field, that they're kind of powerless too. Or if you've an addiction and a mental health issue, that you're kind of the services play hot potato with you. So
Correct.
that can't
Correct.
be very nice for the workers' nervous systems when they're saying, bye, Lisa, we can't deal with you now, and you're at your lowest ebb or in a dangerous kind of place. So, um,
And we need to think about that because there's a lot of focus on staff well-being now
yeah,
because of all the issues in the system. But again, the focus is on the individual worker.
mm,
How do you become more resilient
yeah,
rather than saying, what are the factors here that there aren't alternatives for people?
mm,
There's not a lot of body-based or creative
mm,
anything, even though the evidence and research tells us that that's trauma is held in the body, and we need to have access to those things to
mm,
help us heal and move and shift that. But people, that the whole moral injury, but staff are being said they're depressed, they're
yeah,
anxious, they're this, they're that. Are they really, or are they working in a system that is challenging their values and where they can't be human with it's complex. And I think we need a collective, everything is so individualized, and we need to start seeing this as all of our issue,
mm,
you know, and we've got different experiences and there are different power structures and things, and there's very little accountability from the duty bearers and those who commission and pay for these things.
mm,
But yeah, it's easy to hold that binary, them and us, in many different contexts,
mhm.
but it's so much more complex.
It is. And then if I think I'm conscious, getting more and more conscious of it myself when I bang on about how we need to be more heart-centered and patient in the face of, you know, perplexing behaviors from people that maybe aggravate us or, just might be abusive at times or, self-harming behaviors are hard to witness for people as well. So that we need to be more and more patient, give more and more of ourselves. Well, that's very hard to do as a worker if you feel burnt out by the system and by its ridiculous demands on you and the chronic waiting lists and the fact that some people don't get proper supervision depending on what type of work they do. But say in youth justice in Ireland, where they're working with some of the most marginalised, poor, traumatized young people and their families, there is no clinical type supervision to hold that type of secondary traumatic stress that people might be experiencing. Just on the triggers thing, you said something interesting there to me as well about the uh, for people who might have experienced child sexual abuse, um, that certain behaviors might remind them of grooming experiences, which I think is fascinating. And Bessel van der Kolk even said that someone's smile, someone trying to be welcoming, um,
Mhm.
and friendly, that might remind someone unconsciously of someone who harmed them in a terrible way. Do you think workers in any field get that type of thing, that they can be the trigger, like their behavior, their smile, their voice, their perfume, their aftershave can bring someone, like Karen Traceman says, down a time hole? Um, but in a way, they've done nothing wrong. It's just, and there can be then a very incongruous response where the person might bolt from
Yeah.
the service. Do you
Yeah.
reckon that people get that?
I think that's part of the lack of education around trauma
Yeah.
and the response to it. You
Hmm.
know, it's there's such a big education piece here that would make life better for everybody.
Mm.
You know, because it's like you say, it is that other people run out from the service, or the worker doesn't know what's actually happened and either take it very personally or maybe react very combatively
Yeah.
or try to make it better. And in the overcompensating and not being able to step back and say, I'm noticing,
Yes.
like Bridget would say to me, what could what does that remind you of? When does
Mm.
what age do you think, what could, being curious about it and just creating a bit of space to explore, because sometimes jumping into rescue can
Yes.
be a power thing then. That can be just another trigger,
Mm.
or withdrawing and taking it very personally can be a rejection.
Yes.
So it's complex, but
Yeah.
if you understand
Yeah.
it and if there's curiosity that can come into it, but that's also about education, because when you know that, if you don't know, sometimes people don't. Well, mostly, I think people don't, has been my experience over a
Mm.
long period of time.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant information. Like, just for me as a person in the world, I take things far less seriously and personally than I would have before. But I do know it could be something about me. It could be the words I use. It could be my face. It could be my
Yeah,
voice that reminds someone of a mean teacher who is denigrating, or who knows what, or someone's mom,
correct.
and I don't know that. But having the knowledge is just very freeing. And as you say, being willing to ask a question or just read the energy shift in the room or the person's body bracing and all of that, that's a step in itself, even if you don't know what the solution is. But it's an
Yeah,
interesting point to um not try and be too nice sometimes either, because that can be threatening, that can feel unsafe.
yeah. And it's about, Judith Herman talks about power.
Yeah.
And it's all about power, really. And when we educate people and we see people as, we're working together to figure this out, then we're both in this. I'm bringing this, you're bringing this, but we need to be equipping staff with the
Yeah.
knowledge about the impact of trauma. Staff need to be teaching people. Now that I understand why, and I use it in my training with staff, the polyvagal theory, which they
Mhm.
find really helpful
It's
because it
brilliant.
helps take the blame and shame out. Because
Yeah.
it's like, yes, my nervous system has reacted, but we need to be doing a lot more work on actually helping people understand themselves first and foremost.
Hmm.
Because how are we going to be working with or being with somebody in distress if there's not that awareness of what's going on for us in it?
That's right.
And there's a separate body. We just don't bring the body
Yeah.
into services, in my experience.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah.
We sit people in a clinical room in a chair and we're all sitting very still, with very blank walls, with a very on conversation. And, we know that it's our bodies lead to
They
lots
need
of
to be in
things.
the room consciously.
Yeah, or
Well, I
out
think, yeah,
walking, or in a different environment, or moving,
yeah.
or writing, or drawing, and all of those things.
But it's so interesting as well. That's something that you might say to me if I were a trauma blind psychiatrist, let's say, might activate me as well. And I might feel it in my stomach, and I might like,
Mhm.
mightn't like it. You might remind me of some other difficult
Yeah.
patient from before or whatever,
Yeah.
or my mother, or
Yeah.
whatever it is that I don't know, and I might have a visceral body response to you, and yet I don't honor that, and instead I say something harmful, maybe, or discharge you from the service, or tell you how you have a severe and enduring mental illness, and somehow go on the attack. I think we can really respond inappropriately where we don't
Yeah.
tune into our
And
bodies.
cause a lot of harm.
Yeah,
And there is a responsibility, there is a duty to bring those values to the people that you're working with. But yeah.
it's a slow process. So, these days you're super, super busy, and you told me a little bit there at the start about some of the projects that you're working on. You're also doing a master's, isn't that right? And you mentioned the training in polyvagal theory. Has this chapter in your life been kind of empowering and transformational for you, Lisa?
This chapter in my life is like I'm starting to live my life.
Yeah,
It's
lovely.
quite extraordinary to have been so disconnected from the world. I started yoga a couple of years ago. My therapist does yoga as well. And like when I left the yoga studio last Tuesday and the moon was in the sky, and I came home and the kids were quietly pottering in their beds, and I sat down with Dexter and I was able to actually be connected to all of that, feeling the wind on my skin, um, just being present in
Mm.
in my life.
And in your body.
Um, yeah, yeah. Now that's an ongoing piece of work, but um,
For
it
all of
is
us, Lisa, I think.
extraordinary. Yeah,
For all of
yeah,
us.
yeah. So transformative, yes. It's also been trying to discover who I actually am after
Yeah.
believing that I was, and really a pretty hopeless case.
Mm.
I've got in my notes from the psych ward, the team have lost hope in me and I've lost hope in myself.
Wow.
Um, yeah, they were looking at supported living for me. I'd ended up in ICU twice. Um, so
Those are
I'm very
violent
grateful.
words, I think, to write that the team had lost hope. And yet, I suppose I get it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, it's been an extraordinary time. Um, And I always say it's many factors that came together to help me get to this point, and I think why I do what I do is because everybody has a right to a life that is meaningful to them. This is what my life looks like because this is what matters to me. Sometimes it might be for people that they can actually work in their garden and grow
Yeah,
vegetables. It's different for everybody. It's not about us imposing what that looks like.
of course.
Um, but I just think it's very sad that I think there are a lot of people, because of a system that is very medicalized, um, that don't lead a quality of life they should, and they're not safe places for people to go when they're experiencing extreme distress or the understanding of trauma and things. So I don't know. It's all a very big issue, but I keep just I think it's important to experience joy. I think it's
Yeah.
important to give myself permission to do that. There's almost like a survivor guilt thing that I've somehow
Right.
survived the
And other people
system
haven't.
and I can't, make it better for everybody. Um, so there is that element, but I also know, like with my kids, I can't undo when I wasn't here and
Yeah,
what I wasn't able to do. But I can do what I can do today, and that's different every day, what I can and can't
sure.
do. But it's being, yeah, and just, I guess, conversations, talking like this, doing and trying to accept that I also, I have periods of really struggling.
Mhm.
It's certainly not a straightforward journey at all. Um, but I guess part of what's been transformative for me is connecting. It's just
Yeah.
connecting with others
Mm.
and seeing, what other people are doing. this work I do with PPR, New Script for Mental Health, is calling for looking at the causes of distress, looking at creativity and things as needing to be accessible to people, needing to meet people in their communities, actually value people's voices at a grassroots level, and the power of actually, people coming together, working towards, we are all different, and sometimes, the work is in the relationships, we
Yes.
always say. So if we're not doing it in our own families and in our immediate work, you can be preaching till the cows
Yeah.
come home about what needs to happen. But I think for me, it's holding on to the belief that what each of us do, because it's when I look back at my time over services, it's the little things, like a nurse when I was in the emergency department and was lying there all exposed, who brought a towel to cover me up when I was being stitched. Very often I wasn't.
Wow.
It's little
Mm.
things like that that stay with you, those, and I always
Little
say that to
kindnesses.
people. Yeah, it does matter at the end of the day, someone seeing you, greeting you, so every day we can do stuff
Mm.
that does matter. Um, but yeah, also doing it together, trauma, what it does is we go into survival mode for all of us, stress, trauma,
Mm.
lack of resources. So we hold on to and we compete. And I think if we could all learn to breathe a little deeper and extend a little bit more and say, in fact, if we could connect up a bit more and see our similarities
For sure.
for what we're working for, that vision of something better for us all, um, we need to do our bit to do that, because we're stronger together with that collective voice. On our own, this is all so overwhelming. And sometimes when we fall down, we need others to hold that space and that hope and that place, and that it's okay. I think you're fed this um, thing that the harder you work and the more you do and the more you almost martyr yourself, the more you believe in this and the better you are at it.
Mm.
But actually, we know what happens to our brains. We can't think, we can't creatively problem solve. It's difficult to connect with people, show compassion. Um, yeah,
It just reminded me that you've done, I think, some talks with John Reed in the past, have you? Which,
with John and Lucy.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And it's great that there's and I know, harnessing the voices of lived experience can sometimes be exploitative or tokenistic, but there are some good people who are challenging the orthodox kind of psychiatric value system and bringing people like yourself on board, which is very important to show that healing is possible. And like you say, I mean, the fact that really until quite recently you thought you were fundamentally broken, then got some information, and now are, living a life of meaning and purpose, albeit with ups and downs and struggles along the way. That's profoundly important for people to hear, who might be going through similar situations to you, and for people working that, hope, the hope that we have as well as practitioners in people matters. What we put in their files matter because they'll be reading them. And I
yeah,
know Lisa Cherry does work on trauma-informed record keeping, which strikes me as very important as well, that if you're using terrible, blaming, pejorative language about children that they'll read decades
yeah,
later, that is very harmful. Um, and
yeah.
so, training seems necessary in that regard too.
So much so. Every person has, people talk about giving voice to the voiceless. And to be honest, it drives me mad, right?
Yeah.
Because people have their own voice.
Yeah.
People have resources and skills and gifts that they come into the world with.
Mm.
And it's what happens around us. It's the context of our lives that allow people to be heard or not,
Hmm.
and we've got to stop this arrogant thing of thinking that we are the voice for the voiceless. We
Yeah.
need to be thinking about how we creating conditions and what is our belief in other human beings, in their potential, but also understanding that that doesn't happen in a void. People can't do it on their own. We
No.
need each other.
Mm.
We need each other to do this, and how we talk about people and how we think about people frames our language frames how we and people's basic dignity. These are human rights issues that are going on in mental health, Jane, and I see it more and more. And I think we're going to look back like we do on the days of the lobotomy and say medication and ECT and stuff has been another level of silencing that we do to people.
For sure.
I'm not saying medication doesn't have its place, okay? I'm not
Mhm.
anti-medication, but the pharmaceutical industry has profited significantly. We know in the north of Ireland here, I know in England, accountability, regulation of services, and again, that being a second-rate citizen, very difficult to get any case taken, and there are people's lives are being lost,
Yeah.
and it can be very dehumanizing. And we need a rights framework for mental health, and we need to change the education. We need to add to the education system
Mhm.
that we understand the latest neuroscience.
That's
You know,
right.
it's not rocket science.
No,
I'm not
no,
a huge
no,
academic researcher in anything,
no.
but I know enough to know if we could understand, you know, it's the basic of what people should be.
Yeah, I was saying the other day, because someone said at a conference, Vivian Guerin said, listening to community members and family members of people in addiction was not rocket science. And I was like, to myself, no, it's not rocket science, but it is relational science because, those who are closest to whatever the issue is should have a serious stake in the power. Rebecca Lewis Pancras says
Correct.
those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. I agree, but that might be difficult. But they really need more than a one person with mental health challenges to kind of be the voice for everyone else because they know their own experience. But that is tokenistic and it needs to be real. It needs to be meaningful listening and involvement and shaping.
So, yeah. And people's contexts are all different. So we can't just have one voice, but it is that. And what we've looked at, you know, in our work in the new script, if you look at any campaigns or any big changes, it's always come from the grassroots.
Mm,
It's never been actually from those in power who have made those things happen.
yeah.
Um, yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah.
And I
What?
think people working in services need to join together. My research has been on the well-being of approved social workers around the detention process,
Uh-huh.
and moral injury and stuff. And that's been very, very interesting. And I think people working in, whether it's statutory services, community, and voluntary, we need to be agitating each other a little bit to say, you know, we need to join together here. This is not okay for any of us,
Yeah, that's a great
because
point.
the power is in but then you've got to have space to appreciate that people are all different.
Mm,
And it goes back to, for me, values and
yes,
relationships. You know, you get the values right, human rights, trauma informed are very much interlinked.
I
Dignity,
agree.
compassion, curiosity, humility,
Hmm.
ongoing learning. We have a lot of conversations about relative power in our work, and how we're actually practicing, you know, these things that we say are values in our own. And we need to be talking about this stuff as well. And it does take courage. They're often
Yes.
not comfortable conversations, but they're powerful. And people are amazing when you give them a little space to be. You know, people come up with amazing things together.
I look forward to reading your research. It sounds like really, really important stuff. And you're so right. I mean, it goes back to me a bit to the body again that like we've just got to be able to listen to things that make us uncomfortable. Where we do get a tightness in our chest or start to sweat and feel uncomfortable because what people have experienced has been harmful and uncomfortable and we should feel it. But the kind of inclination and the urge to scurry from the room like rats, as Judith Herman used that phrase about disclosures of certain kinds, it's also some
Correct.
way understandable. So it's like that we need to create the space where sometimes we can feel so unpleasant and we do want to run, but that we can hold it safe enough, I guess, is about as much as we can ever get, because people won't necessarily feel fully safe amid these uncomfortable conversations, but they're the only way that positive progress is really possible if we can get beyond the need to feel at ease all the time, because it's it's kind of unnatural. It means we're not being challenged in our belief systems and assumptions if we've heard it all before. And
Yeah. But we do, I think there is for me, there's a responsibility as well in anything that I do and I work in the new script. We always think about at any event or at anything that I'm doing, how am I creating a space here that's not blaming and shaming,
mhm,
you know, but that also speaks what needs to be spoken, whilst also understanding the response, the people those triggered responses. So how is this environment set up that I'm providing?
mhm,
So I can be responsible for that. And how
yeah,
does that align? That those uncomfortable, more difficult things can be held in some
yeah,
way, but also, yeah, trusting people a bit too. Power. We need to be talking more about power. It's a lot
yes,
of
I
yeah.
agree. Um, do you have time for just two more questions, or are you out of time?
If you do, yeah.
Yeah. Well, just on the barriers to, I suppose, within the system to kind of to listening to lived experience, within mental health or other services, um, and then learning from people's experiences like yours, and and then involving people in various roles, whether therapeutically or in a peer support way. Um, I presume you believe there's value in this, but what are the main barriers to doing it more and doing it more effectively?
Well, I think, I'm very conscious that without the recovery college, I wouldn't be here because nobody would have employed me, you
Hmm.
know. So, and the learning that I got there, but seeing the system was never set up to include people with lived experience. And I think it can be very harmful for people. And I think there's inequalities there. Actually a whole can of worms. And I ended up leaving because of issues that I'd escalated over a 2-year period. Um, what I was seeing with peer workers that were never addressed. So there were ethical challenges for me. Um, yeah, the work I'm doing with new scripts, grassroots activists, people are it's completely different. That works for me. It was
Hmm.
challenging. It's challenging, managing all of us and creating those spaces. So I think peer workers do a lot of good. They really good roles in principle, and people like anywhere, people are doing great pockets of work, but I don't know that within the system is the place because I don't think it's true to the source of what it is.
Yeah,
And people are marginalized and sidelined. There's not good supports in place for people working in those ways. So it becomes co-opted
yeah,
to meet the needs of the service. Just as staff experience who want to work in a certain way and then they're meeting all those things. So I think that's challenging. What was the other question about that?
the value of it, having peers somehow
It,
involved.
I think peers should be everywhere. I think even
Yeah,
staff should see the value of
yeah,
peer. I mean, in my research, the research tells us that peer connection, whatever that is,
yeah,
whether it's around your experience of this or it's around your role that you're doing, because it's about relationships,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
It's that connecting
Support
and
and
being able to talk
co-regulation.
to you. Yeah, that's all it is actually. So peer support is necessary everywhere. Um, I think we forget in mental health, that's why I left as well, because I was never called a professional.
Right.
But I'm a good trainer. I'm a good
Yeah,
trainer. I've worked in this field. I'm more than my lived experience.
yes.
I didn't want to be the recovery girl because I was certainly not recovered.
Yeah,
And
yeah. I get you.
it's
Yeah.
also I was just being labeled again.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of barriers everywhere, but I also think that people, those in power, if they really want to learn, need to go to people in their context and in their lives, not expect them to come to tables around boardrooms trying to get transport in their environment. You really want to learn, you need to go to people. You need to see what's happening on the ground. And then you need to be willing to do something with that and
I
to
love
be
that.
honest with what you can and cannot do.
Yeah.
people aren't stupid. We don't think that things are magically going to be done, but
Hmm.
we need to give people enough respect to say, this is what I can do, this is what I can't do, and then deliver on it.
Yeah.
Do what you
To
say,
have some
follow up on it.
outcomes. Yeah. Not
And some
just
of
a
those
listening
basics. Yeah,
exercise. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
I find consultation is important, but often it's just to say we consulted with these groups, produce a report, list the
and so what?
organizations, and move on with what your policy plan was anyway. Um, Whereas the nothing about us
Yeah.
without us is very much more, the people, closest to the pain, so to speak, need to have a strong driving voice and energy in
Yeah.
whatever the plan is.
And that's what we're doing in the new script. We're imagining the new and creating the new. We know what the issues are, but we're not just going to be drawn into tick a box. It's
Mhm.
about holding those to account, and it's letting the people on the ground decide where they're wanting to go and what they're wanting to do to
Amazing.
create the change. Yeah, it's
Very,
exciting.
very exciting sounding, Lisa. Um, so just the final one then, and it kind of again ties in nicely to that sort of wider point. What can politicians and policymakers do to enable all children, no matter where they're born, no matter what their skin color, gender, whatever else um, might be, to have a safe, healthy, connected, and equitable childhood so that they are better placed to flourish as adults? It's a big question, but any ideas
Well, I
at
think
all?
cross departmental need to see that this is everybody's responsibility across departments.
Hmm.
Housing, transport, the access to education, access to health, all those things have to be done and have to be invested in. We know that the early years, brain developments and everything going on there. But I have a concern at the moment about investment into more mental health interventions in
Mm.
school rather than teaching kids about emotional regulation,
Yeah.
different language for it, because we're in a way silencing children as well, rather than
And
teaching them about,
pathologizing them.
yeah, rather than saying, actually, things are not good at home. I haven't got breakfast. Mom's trying to manage this all on her. We don't have enough food. Don't have decent housing. We need to be teaching kids that those things affect us. And
Yes.
so, how do we pull together as a community and how do we help each other learn to soothe and regulate? And what are the things that are good to do that? Otherwise, we're saying there's something wrong with you when
Mm.
actually there's not.
Yeah.
We need to be educating in a different way. So that's a concern for me. And I think, yeah, we need to be looking very carefully at mental health interventions in schools and what those are.
Yeah, thank you for that. I couldn't agree more in the sense that often I go around saying we all have a role to play in this. We mightn't see our relevance to other people's children or, struggling moms, but we can maybe be a little bit kinder or have a conversation where our inclination might be to avoid them. And who knows, invite people to participate in community events, even if we think they will have no interest. You never know. You never
Yeah.
know. And that might expand the relational health and wealth of people, which is so important
Or
for all of
find
our
out what
well-being.
people are struggling with. Actually go to
Yes.
people and ask, and what do they need? What do
Yes.
they think the solution is? And then go in and help them to do that, rather than thinking we have the answers as well.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Beautiful. We'll leave it there. What do you
Yes.
need is a great question to begin with in any interaction with the people that we might like to help and support. Lisa Morrison, thank you so much for joining me on Relationships Matter. It was a delight and a great learning
Lovely
experience
to
for
talk.
me. Thank you.
Good, good. Pleasure. And we all can make a difference, Jane.
We can.
In every interaction, we can make a difference that you might never see has a ripple effect on somebody. So it does all matter, even when we feel like we can't or what we're doing isn't enough. So
Thank you, Lisa.
anyway, lovely to talk and you
Yeah,
go well. See.
amazing.
Okay.
Bye.